Hello, everyone. Welcome to the UXPA Educational Webinar Program. I am Rajesh Kalidindi, a treasurer of UXPA, hosting this webinar from my home in Seattle. If you are joining the first time these webinars, and please be aware that UXPA is entirely driven by a volunteer organization, which is founded in 1991 to enable people in the user experience career path. In addition to this free webinars, we also offer a virtual short course, which is coming up in November on chatbots. Please look for that on our website, uxpa.org. And if you have not registered, please do. And we also offer annual in-person conference, which is coming up in June 2023. We are working very hard to go through all the submissions at this point. And we also offer online magazine, which is a free and journal of usability studies, and a mentorship program as well. While many of these offerings are free for anyone, but some of these offerings are heavily discounted for our members. If you are not a member, please become a member today by going into the uxpa.org. Well, today I'm very excited about the webinar for two reasons. One is October is the National Disability Employment Awareness Month, which is also called #NDEA. The second point is I am passionate about accessibility, and I work as an accessibility coach, a trainer, and consultant myself to deliver inclusive digital solutions. So I am very excited to bring two fabulous speakers from the accessibility field to talk about overcoming the common accessibility pitfalls to deliver fabulous forms. Alisa Smith and Sarah Kinneer, both are experts on this topic, and from the AudioEye, and both of them are joining us today from Georgia, Atlanta. Alisa is an accessibility evangelist, and Sarah is a solution engineer. So we are recording this session for lateral viewing, and which will be available on our uxpa.org webinar section. If you have any questions during the session, please use the chat box. And without any delay, Sarah and Alisa, please take it from here.
Great. Thank you so much, Rajesh. It's great to be with you here today to talk about fabulous forms. We chose forms because it's a great way. It's first of all, a place where people have a lot of different accessibility questions, but also forms, they're a great starting point for accessibility because we can get into a lot of different additional things beyond just forms from here. So I anticipate that you might have questions in the chat. We do have some of our colleagues from AudioEye in the chat ready to answer questions, so feel free to utilize that throughout. I am Sarah Kinneer. I use she, her pronouns. I'm a solutions engineer here at AudioEye. My history is 14 years of teaching children with disabilities, and at which point I decided a little career change was in the cards for me, and I went into tech. I went to Georgia Tech's full stack development boot camp and graduated that and joined AudioEye in 2019. I'm located in Atlanta, Georgia, and I am certified by the International Association of Accessibility Professionals, the IAAP, as a certified professional in web accessibility, which means that I have passed the web accessibility specialist and certified professional in accessibility core competencies exams. I also do self-identify as disabled. So I want to start also with this introduction to include an inclusive introduction for anyone who may not be able to see me as I am on camera. I have long blonde hair. I'm middle-aged female, Caucasian. Today I'm wearing a a bright blue shirt with some flowers on it, and it's getting to be fall, so it's a little chilly, but I'm here in my living room in Atlanta, Georgia, and this is actually doubles as my home office. So behind me, you can see a bookshelf full of all kinds of reading materials and pictures of my family. And I'll pass it to Alisa.
Good day, everybody. My name is Alisa Smith. I also use she, her pronouns. I am the accessibility evangelist at AudioEye, which is a very interesting way to say somebody who does research within the accessibility space and talks about accessibility after I do that research. I've been working in technology in one way, shape, or form, design, development, or quality assurance for more than 20 years. I live near Atlanta, like Sarah does. Also, like Sarah, I am a certified professional in accessibility core competencies. I'm very excited to talk to everybody about forms today. Let's get going. So today we are going to discuss multiple accessibility and usability overlaps and differences. We are going to discuss accessibility in general, as well as the common accessibility pitfalls that you can encounter as a creator of forms. As we know, forms make up an enormous amount of what we do to collect data and get user information and get access to information and search for information. So there are a lot of ways that you can sort of inadvertently make mistakes in accessibility in forms. So we will put that all together for you and help you avoid some of those issues with some best practices. So let's get going with the next slide. Go ahead, Sarah.
So forms are difficult to design. They always have been. Even before the internet, paper forms caused difficulty. But having a well-designed form has become even more important as our lives have moved online. Especially, post-COVID, so much of what we do now is online. It's really, really important that your form is well designed, not just for people with disabilities, but people who just maybe need to access a form. Maybe they're older, maybe they're they're learning the internet. They're younger, they're learning how to navigate, right? A form can result in making a sale, gaining a follower, adding, but even beyond that in just accessing, right? So the big idea here is that accessibility and beautiful design are not mutually exclusive. I so often hear people say, well, to make my form accessible, it can't be exciting, it can't be beautiful, it can't be amazing. Accessibility and beautiful design are not mutually exclusive. And the best experiences for everyone, they're usable for all people, regardless of ability or disability. So we're gonna dive right in. We're gonna talk about accessibility and usability to begin with. So we're going to go through lots of different topics here. And we're going to start with what is accessibility, right? So when we're talking about accessibility, there's very often everyone thinks, oh, I know what that means. And then when they're asked to define it, they go, I honestly, how do I define accessibility? It's access, right? And one of my favorite quotes is from Alistair Duggan. He is a vocal advocate of accessible design. He led the creation of accessibility guidance at the UK government digital service. And this is a great quote. He says, accessibility means that people can do what they need to do in a similar amount of time and effort. That's very important, similar amount of time and effort as someone that does not have a disability. It means that people are empowered, can be independent, very important, independent. You don't need help to do this, and will not be frustrated by something that is poorly designed or implemented. Web accessibility specifically means that everyone can perceive, understand, navigate, and interact with the web, as well as contribute to the web. And that's by the W3C, the World Wide Web Consortium's definition of what web accessibility means. So not only do you have to be able to perceive the form, know what's on it, understand it, navigate it, get through it, interact with it, add your information, add what you need to. You should also be able to contribute, and forms are a great way to contribute to the web as well. You know, we see reviews, we see a blog, you know, blog posts and threads on blogs. So your forms are really, really integral to accessibility in that contribution part of the definition. Accessibility is actually considered distinct from but related to usability when we get down into the actual descriptions. So usability is one thing, accessibility is within that. It's distinct from it. And Alisa is going to get into that.
Okay. So according to the W3C, which is where I go for all things web, there are, as Sarah mentioned, some overlaps and some distinctions between accessibility, usability, and inclusion. So accessibility, as Sarah just mentioned, addresses those aspects related to an equivalent user experience for people with disabilities. Web accessibility being that that people with disabilities can, again, perceive, operate, understand, navigate, interact with sites and tools. Usability includes that user experience design. So that also, according to W3C, is about designing products that can be effective, efficient, and satisfying. Usability includes that design. So we want to ensure that the general aspects that impact everyone don't disproportionately impact people with disabilities, right? So that's where we want to ensure that your usability practice includes people with disabilities, because so often practices and research don't necessarily sufficiently address the needs of people with disabilities. So, and then we have inclusion, right? Which is sort of the most generic blanket term here, is about diversity, ensuring that involvement of everyone to the greatest extent possible. In some regions, that is also called universal design, which is another way of looking at this, where it addresses a really broad range of issues and conditions. So people with disabilities, access to quality hardware, a broad range of different types of software, connectivity, computer literacy, economic situation, geographic location, culture, age, language, all of these things can disable or enable somebody depending upon those conditions. So to be able to be inclusive is to ensure that you make contingencies for as many of these conditions as you can.
Thanks, Alisa.
Sure.
I actually just realized I left out a tiny part back here on the definitions. We have a numeronym for accessibility called that accessibility starts with an A and ends with a Y, and there's 11 letters in between. And so we have a numerum, a little way of shortening that to A11Y or ally or ally. And I want to just make sure to let you guys know right ahead of time, we may refer to accessibility as A11Y, ally, ally. That's just a shortening of the word accessibility. So wanted to make sure that we talked about that. And let's talk about some common pitfalls. So let's start with navigating without a mouse. So I think I am probably not the only person in the room who's had this happen. If you're a user who uses a mouse and you use one that has a battery and suddenly your battery goes dead, or you drop it and it breaks and suddenly you don't have your mouse to use, or you use a trackpad normally and something went wrong, you accidentally, I've been the person who's turned off the trackpad accidentally and been like, how did I do that? What did I just do? Had to figure out how to turn it back on.
Or you can break your pointer finger.
Oh yeah.
All sorts of contingencies can occur to
All
make you
kinds
have
of
to
things.
navigate without a mouse.
So everybody can probably think about those moments of panic of, oh my gosh, my mouse isn't working. I don't know how to navigate and finish the task that I'm doing. Maybe it's a learning thing. I don't know how. But also, when we don't build our sites accessibly, if you're not building your form accessibly, you might not actually be able to do it without using a mouse, without using your pointer finger, without using, you may not be able to use the keyboard to do what you need to do otherwise. So keyboard accessibility, it's one of the most important aspects of web accessibility. It's kind of the first thing. It's easy to check. If you don't use a screen reader, you can still use your keyboard and see if you're able to get to all of your form fields, right? All functionality of web content must be available using a keyboard only. So I said, think about that frustration of your mouse not working. Now imagine that you don't use a mouse, you use a screen reader, or you use a switch device, or you use eye tracking software or voice software, right? That's how you always interact. A lot of developers don't realize when they're learning to develop, when they're like me going through boot camps, they're taught to add click events, right? So add this click event to this component, and they don't know or haven't been taught that keyboard functionality, you need a key down, you need a keyboard event, right? It doesn't necessarily work with just the click event. So you have to code keyboard accessibility if you're making custom components. Great thing we're going to talk about later is with native HTML, that functionality is built in. But if you're building out custom components, you want to do something fancy and you're not keeping in mind that you need keyboard events, you could make a beautiful, wonderful, amazing component that's going to be a great user experience for everyone who can use a mouse, but completely impossible for anyone who can't use a mouse to use. So a few pitfalls with navigating without a mouse. Keyboard navigation order is not necessarily predictable or logical. So imagine you're building out a site and you're using CSS to position everything where you want it on your site. If you have built out a form and then you're like, oh, I want to position this cool thing up in the top right corner. Well, the top right corner may not be the logical place for that component if you're using a screen reader, if you're trying to figure out the structure without viewing the form, right? But also you might move something with CSS out of the visual order and make it difficult for someone who maybe uses magnification to find that once they've gotten to it. Like, where am I moving? Where has the screen just jumped? If I'm magnified to 400%, something just didn't make sense. So make sure that all interactive elements are focused and operated using the keyboard, using only your keyboard in a logical order. And that means putting it in order in the DOM order most of the time. We'll get to that some more too. Another really common pitfall with forms is that a component might trap the keyboard user on a control or link, preventing further navigation. So we tend to call those tab traps. But if you go into a form and you're stuck and you can't tab to the next, say, input field or the next list box, right? You can't tab out of it, you're trapping somebody there. And when you're talking about that, try to go forwards and backwards when you're testing that. I very often see everyone's, tabs work great when they're moving forward, but if I have to go back to a previous entry and make a correction or change something, I realize I can't shift tab and go back to the previous one. So really important, forwards and backwards. Remember that custom designed fields may not be operable using only a keyboard if you've only coded for tap events or click events, right? Use native HTML when possible. And when you are creating custom fields, make sure that you're actually designing in those keyboard events and making sure they're working properly. One other really common thing that we see is when a user is able to navigate behind a pop-up window that requires user action. So let's say you create a form, and on submit, you're going to get a modal pop-up that says, success, you did this. And then you have to kind of clear that pop-up. And this is just an example. If your keyboard focus, if your focus doesn't move into that form, or into that modal, excuse me, how would you interact to close that modal out? If you're somebody using magnification, again, you may have a difficult time finding the way to close that or how to close that out. If you're using a screen reader, you may be stuck behind it and not be able to close it out. Really, really important to make sure that, anyone can close those dialogues, can interact with those dialogues. And with that, you want to make sure that when you're creating tab loops, and that's when we're putting those dialogues together, that you're confining the keyboard navigation using the tab loops only when user action is mandatory. So if you have a pop-up and nobody else can interact with the page behind it, make sure that you're trapping that focus within that pop-up window. But if you have, let's say, a dialogue that shows up at the bottom of the screen and I can still interact with the page, even though that dialogue is down there, I don't have to close it, that I'm not stuck in that dialogue, right? I can still navigate with the rest of the page, even though that's open. Alisa, did you have anything to add here?
I don't. I think you covered it all.
Nice. I'm watching the chat for any questions, so feel free to add questions as they come up. And Alisa.
All right, let's talk about labels a little bit. So as may be obvious, labels are used to provide necessary information, right? The user has to know what to enter in the field. Unfortunately, sometimes in testing, we find that the visible label near the field maybe isn't actually announced by the screen reader. It'll just announce a field that the screen reader, for example, may say text edit or unlabeled button, which means that somehow programmatically the label and the field or the label and the component are not associated. So we want to be very sure that our developers are programmatically associating our labels. And a quick way to test that is you can actually click on the label itself using your mouse while you're testing. And if the focus goes into the field itself, then you know that that label and field are programmatically associated. So we've also encountered forms with field labels that are very low contrast and just really difficult to read, or all capital letters, which also reduces readability for some folks. So we want to make sure that, this sounds silly, but that our field labels are visible. So for those of us who are designing, we want to make sure to avoid light on light or dark on dark, because someone could actually miss your labeling due to poor contrast. And then I think the other sort of design field moment that we have is fields that don't look like fields. I think a few years ago, Google Material Design came out and all of the text fields all had no bounding boxes, just a bottom border. And people, they did some studies and found that people in general, not just people with disabilities, had trouble distinguishing the fields from the page, because there was just that simple line beneath the text field that didn't necessarily indicate for them a conventional appearance of a field. So we want to make sure that there's sufficient contrast of the background and foreground. I think Material actually ended up changing their design a bit so that the field itself has a different background and an underline beneath, so that I think it's a subtle contrast difference or just a subtle change, but enough to really allow a typical user to be able to discern that those are actually fields that could have input. And then, let's avoid that sort of unconventional styling, or if you decide to go a little more unconventional, make sure that you are clearly labeling the fields so that it is understood what is to happen there, that actually is a field for input. And then that leads us to our next slide, because labeling is more than just labels.
Totally. And it's so much more than just labels. So when you're thinking about how do I label this field, a lot of times you're thinking about, well, what hints might somebody need? What formats might be needed here? Because if you just say phone number, I personally, having, being the age that I am and having so much experience with form fields on the internet, I'm going to go, okay, do I put dashes in here? Do I put parentheses in my area code? Do I need to include a 1? If you put a date field, if I am from the UK and you are from the US, we write our months and our days differently, right? So what is the format that needs to be in? If it's not, if you're, an international company, you need to make sure that you're letting everybody know, how do I expect this data to come in? And I would not assume that everybody in the world is from my small neck of the woods, right? So even if you're just a home ground somewhere very specific region, you still are best off giving hints and formats. So a couple pitfalls with hints and formats. They help users understand what data to enter and what format to enter it in, right? If it's likely that a user would have to make a guess, then your best bet is to just don't make them have to guess. Don't make me have to guess on what you want, right? So pitfalls here, tooltips that are only available on Hover and not available to keyboard only users. We see it all the time. You might even have the little eye information icon or a little question mark icon. And when you hover over that, or you try to access that, you can do it. You can hover over it with the mouse and you get this great hint. You get a great hint. But it's not available to me if I'm a keyboard only user, right? So if I'm using a switch or eye tracking, I can't get to that. So we need to make sure that our hints are actually available to everybody. And also with hints, be careful that they're not given too late to be helpful, right? So imagine the frustration. You filled out an entire form, then you submit it and it gets returned, and there's numerous errors on submission that if you just had hints, you would have been like, oh, you wanted in this format. Oh, this is what you wanted, right? So give hints in a timely fashion. Give them up front. Make sure they're available to everybody. Make sure the data format is there. As far as data format, an alternative to that, if you don't want to put, mm/dd/YYYYY, which is the convention for dates here in the US, if you wanted to just accept other mainstream formats for common data points and, manipulate that on the back end, we'll put it that way, sanitize it however you need to, but accept different mainstream formats, that could make it easier to for users as well. They don't necessarily need the hint if you're accepting the format they're using. Very often we find the hints not available on Hover. So just really, really important. I'm going to drill that home. Make sure that you can go through with your keyboard and you can see it.
Last thing I'll say on this one is, if you find the need to explain any entry at length, maybe rethink what you're collecting and how you're collecting it.
Yes.
There are other field options, maybe. There are maybe a different way to collect that information. But if you find yourself having to explain a lot about what you need that user to enter, you may want to rethink the design a little bit too. Something else to just keep in mind. hints can get a little off the wall. There are things, there's always going to be an exception. And the one that I keep thinking of with this is passwords, right? Passwords have very specific requirements. That may be one where you have to give a sizable and intricate hint, but not a lot of other common data.
Right. Perfect. Thank you, Alisa.
Sure. So this leads us to another sort of labeling and format hint related opportunity, which is placeholder. So oftentimes, and what I mean by placeholder is text inside a field that is often put there by one of two ways. One, a value that has been put in the field itself that has to be cleared before the user enters something. Another way people do this is using the placeholder attribute in HTML, which actually will come back if you delete everything in the field. But again, both of these disappear. So using a placeholder as a label or a formatting hint puts a lot of burden on the short-term memory. It disappears as soon as that user starts typing or as soon as they clear if you're using the value method. But the fact is they have to clear it again in order to expose that placeholder again. And that may not be a good user experience. From a assistive technology perspective, a screen reader may not announce placeholder properly. It may be skipped, or depending on the navigation technique that the user is using, it just may not be read by their particular assistive technology. Another item to consider with placeholder is contrast. Again, like typical labels, if the placeholder is too light colored, people may not be able to read it. If it's too dark, people may think you filled in the form for them. And so they may not think it's placeholder at all. And we've definitely in testing experienced placeholder text in the field that animates out of the field.
Yes.
So if you're going to put it outside the field, just put it outside the field. Not the animation, that's an awful lot of resources on a client computer that isn't for a big payoff, and it can be a little distracting. So something that we notice with a lot of frequency that maybe is not a best practice there. But I mean, really, it's about labeling needing to stay visible in order to help users stay on track and avoid putting anything that is important in placeholder because it disappears. I keep coming back when I talk about placeholder to a movie called 50 First Dates, where the woman has a memory impairment as a result of an accident, and she is taken to a place where there are other people with disabilities, and she meets a man who has a short-term or has a memory of only about 5 seconds. That is the example I think of every time I go to put placeholder into a field, or I think about designing placeholder as somebody who doesn't have a memory of more than 5 seconds. While it may give you a laugh, it's also a reality for some people that they just don't have that. They just don't have the ability to remember what they needed to type in that field. Yeah. All right. And then I think that actually leads us to our next field. I'll call it a fun field trip.
Let's talk a little bit about autofill and autocomplete, right? So some users with physical mobility limitations, chronic pain, they'll want to maximize their use of autocomplete because the fewer keystrokes they need to make, the more accessible a form is for them. Additionally, users with certain cognitive and attention disabilities may struggle to remember personal information, especially if they're just learning, like say a new address or phone number. I have ADHD and autism. I specifically have difficulty remembering, you know, when I move to a new place, what is my zip code right now, right? So I use autofill. Being able to utilize autocompletes can help these individuals tremendously. Additionally, be cognizant of things like combo back style search fields, which auto-populate options, right? It's really not at all uncommon for us to find that developers have built out custom components that either do not allow that keyboard only access, like we've talked about when you're using those native HTML elements, the keyboard functionality is built in. But if you're building it custom, you're using divs, you're using spans. When you're building that out, if you haven't thought about how the keyboard only user is going to access that, and coded that specifically for them, you may have options that don't announce to screen reader users or that aren't even available for them to select because they can't get to them. So let's talk about the pitfalls again. Autofill being disabled. Don't disable it. That forces that user to type or retype previously entered data that is specific to them, data that's stored in their computer. Keep it enabled. Autocomplete that steals focus, forcing users to engage with it. That is very, very, very frustrating when the autocomplete actually like continues to complete and I want to put something else in it, right? Stealing focus, taking it somewhere else, forcing me to engage with it if I don't want to. Autocomplete that doesn't work as expected or can't be dismissed with common keystrokes. Again, I'm stuck there. I can't move past this. I can't put in what I want to put in. For combo box style fields, screen reader users that aren't made aware when the options populate, right? So I think of, when I think about combo box style fields, I'm kind of thinking of, imagine you have a search field. And in that search field, as you're typing, you get options of products that you can go and get to. Well, are you letting anybody know in that custom field that you've made that they actually have the option to get to those products, that those products are auto-populating for them? And, you know, after you enter 3 characters, use the arrow keys to browse the options, right? That may not be delivered to somebody. And maybe you've set it up that you can't use the arrow keys, you have to use the tab key to get to them, or you have to do some other strange combination of keyboard navigation to get to those things. That needs to be clear to somebody who can't see the visual display. Just the fact that it exists might be lost on some users, right? So maybe announce to users how and when the options will populate. Now, I'm going to clarify that that's if the interaction is not standard, right? So we don't need to tell a screen reader user how to navigate using their screen reader if it's a standard interaction. So know what kind of form you're building, what kind of component you're building, and know, is this different from the standard? Is this what people expect to navigate? Is this how people expect to navigate this? Or is it different? Do I need to give additional information on how to navigate this because it's not standard? And if you're having to give additional information that's not standard, it kind of goes back to that whole rethink your design. If you're interacting in a way that's not standard for a screen reader user to interact, or for a user using switches or visual or voice communication to interact, maybe you need to rethink that component entirely. So what's required, Alisa?
So required is another area of, you know, all of these things are sort of, as you may have guessed, are sort of dovetailing together to create a well-labeled, clearly formatted, clearly visible, or clearly navigable form. And one of the sort of, we're getting to the final. One of the next items that you need to consider is what's required, as if a field is required. So, you know, the placement of the required labeling is something that we encounter a lot in testing, where maybe there's an asterisk next to a field label. But maybe it's, as we talked about earlier, that programmatic association of the label to the field that needs to occur. one of the pitfalls we see with some frequency is that asterisk that is to indicate that a field is required is not actually part of the label, so that maybe when a screen reader user or a other type of AT user who navigates using labels may not have access to that required information. We also see field labels that have an asterisk, but there's no definition of what the asterisk means. There is a certain argument that there is a convention these days that the web has been around for more than, 20, 30 years now. And do we really need to worry about telling people what an asterisk means next to a field? Yes. The answer is yes, you do, because not everybody is necessarily clear that the convention of that convention. What also can occur is that asterisk is often a true red on a white background, which happens to be a very low contrast color combination. So if somebody has issues with their vision, they may not ever see that red asterisk. And then the other item that does come up with some frequency is that there are HTML attributes and ARIA attributes that you can use to tag a field as required. So if you do not use those, it is very possible that a person must rely on your labeling, which may not be robust enough for them to understand that a field is required. Now, they may leave the field empty, submit the form, get an error message, go back and fill it in. But it also would be better for them to understand beforehand that that field needed to be required. Now, best practices. We have our first here is to only collect the minimum required information. If you don't need to know my cat's color, don't ask me. If you need to know what color my cat is, then by all means, put required, the word, or the attribute, or define whatever field indicator you are going to use as a required indicator. Also, the option is whichever is fewer optional or required fields, label those. So some you may just want to put as optional because maybe you only have one optional field on your form. You also don't have to use an asterisk. You could use another symbol as long as you tell people ahead of time what that symbol means and that symbol is presented with enough contrast. Finally, on best practices is to use the required attribute or the ARIA-required equal to true property. Either of those will indicate for someone who is using a screen reader that that particular field is required. I think that's everything.
No, that's
with
great.
Required, but that it's a big one. I think sort of the big takeaway is really write out the word required or be sure to use those properties and attributes whenever possible. That's really the clearest, easiest way to ensure that folks understand exactly what you're looking for. And
use it to begin with, right? So yes. Don't leave it off and I have to submit the form and then I realize, oh, you did need that, right? Yep. I'm one who does not like to put my phone number on everything because I will get spam calls, so if I can get away with not putting my phone number, I will. But if you require it of me and I know ahead of time, then I don't have to submit and find out later, oh, they're making me put my phone number in.
Yeah, that's a great one.
Error messages. This one is by far one that I see almost daily error messages. Imagine submitting a form, it comes back with errors, but you actually can't see there's any kind of error, nothing is announced to you. What do? Do you keep trying to submit the form or do you assume it went through properly, right? I've actually, I've had this happen on so many occasions. You fill out a form, you hit submit, and there is no feedback whatsoever for visual users, for anyone. To know, did that form even submit? Do I do it again? How many times do I submit this form before I, give up, right? That's the conundrum that users who have visual disabilities face when error messages are lacking or difficult to see or associate to their respective fields, when they're generic, when they're simply never announced, right? So same kind of thing. There's a couple of different ways to ensure that error messages are properly announced, but I'm going to start with, it's important to plan which method you will use, because this is one area where you can try to do too much and you can end up mucking the whole thing up. All right. So there's two prevalent ways to handle error announcements to screen reader users. And I'm really focusing on screen reader users in this particular situation because a lot of times our errors will be visible to users, right? So we'll have a visible error, but it's really, really important that we're making sure that that is being translated over to assistive technologies like screen readers, right? So two really prevalent ways to handle this. So there's one popular method is to use ARIA live regions, right? So ARIA live regions are regions that will announce when something is updated. So it'll announce an error message has entered the DOM. Really important, if you're using ARIA, if you're using the WAI ARIA specification, you know what you're doing. Rule number 1 of that specification is don't use it. So the reason that's rule number 1 is it's powerful, but it's dangerous. So make sure that if you're using this method, your developers know how to use it, because there are some tricks to getting it to work properly. So that popular method of we're going to announce it using ARIA live when that error message enters the DOM. This can be done well in certain circumstances, but if you mix this up with another method that I'll talk about next, you can actually shoot yourself in the foot, right? You can make it so that you don't get that announcement at all. So there's some things to be wary of. If you send focus to the field with the error, you risk interrupting that ARIA live announcement in such a way that the screen reader user would never hear the error message at all. So even though you coded it properly, you have ARIA live, if you're sending focus after that ARIA live announcement, you could be interrupting that. So you may the other thing is that you may have an error state that comes up, maybe you're halfway through typing and your error state comes up in the middle of that, so really immediate feedback, but you might interrupt someone halfway through completing their entry, interrupt them in filling out the field, change their focus, lose their focus. So be very careful when you're using ARIA Live. Make sure if you're going to use that method that you have tested it with assistive technologies. My personal preferred method is to use ARIA described by to programmatically link that error message to the field with its associated error. That steps over some of these issues, and it allows you to send focus to the first field with an error message if the form fails to submit. And it ensures that that error message is available to users, right? So you're using ARIA described by, and what that does is it programmatically links that error message to that field so that when you send focus to the first field, which is a great thing to do, if I submit a long form and it comes back with an error, I don't want to have to scan that form to figure out where my error is. I'd love my focus to go directly to where that error is. That's where my first error is. I'm going to correct that. Then I can go through the rest of the form, make sure everything else is good, submit it again, boom, it goes through, right? So sending that focus is why I prefer using that ARIA described by, and you can link that error message using the ID. Users will quickly understand the form hasn't submitted properly when focus is sent to a field with an error. If users have visual impairments, again, I want to be taken right there. So if you're using screen magnification, I have a lot less searching to do. One really important call out on this method is to be sure you're using unique IDs for each error message. So when those things are being coded out, your ID is unique. And that's so that that error message is properly associated with the input field or the form field, right? So again, pitfalls with this placement of error messages can make it difficult to properly associate an error to its form field. So if you have fields that, let's say you have horizontal, a form and it's vertical form, and next to each field, to the right of each field, let's say you have an error message that pops up. Is that in the right place if you magnify that screen to 400%, right? Or can you visually associate it? So check when you're placing your fields, check what it is at different magnification levels. Check where that field shows up on different devices, different screen sizes. Make sure that it's very clear, this error goes with this field. Error messages that aren't announced to screen reader users, right? So again, making sure that you're using ARIA Live properly, you're using ARIA Describe By properly, you're picking one good announcement method and you're sticking to it, and you're not overriding it with some other techniques, right? Reliance on color alone to indicate an error. Do not just put a red outline around a form field. That's color alone. Anyone who has a color deficiency is going to have difficulty. Anyone who has low vision and may need more contrast could be having difficulty finding that error, right? Inline field validation that isn't announced or interrupts screen reader users, right? So that's that I'm stuck in this field and now I've had an announcement and now I'm not sure where I am in typing my answer out, and I'm not sure, have I made an error already? I'm only halfway done typing this word. All of those kinds of issues that come up there. And generic error messages that don't give users hints to fix the error. We see all the time, because convention is, because a lot of form libraries do this. They say, this field is required. This field is required. This field is required. But they don't tell you which field it is that is required or needs to be fixed in the error message itself. So again, best practices, place error messages in proximity to fields. Ensure placement is consistent at different magnification levels, different devices. Remember, all error messages need to be unique, descriptive, and programmatically associated with fields. Make sure you're using unique IDs. Never rely on color alone for anything accessibility. And when using WAI ARIA, understand when and how to properly apply attributes like ARIA invalid even, right? Choose a method. Don't combine incompatible methods. And we are running kind of short on time, so let's take a quick look at some examples.
This first one, the first example to the left, has a black background and gray labels. So first and foremost, too little contrast of the field labels to the background. That field also is that field level is also, has a very lightweight font, which makes it less readable. The button on this page, however, has incredibly good contrast. That register for this event button is very clear, as it is white with black text on a black background. It's beautiful, shining. Clear language for the labels and formatting hints. And the formatting hints in this case are placeholder, which can be problematic, as we discussed earlier, because it disappears. Example 2 has a white background with dark gray or black text, and that has excellent contrast. As I said earlier, all caps is a bit less readable because there is no kind of difference in the height of the letters, making decoding a little more difficult. No formatting hints needed here. The data is very simple. And the visible focus indicator is something here I wanted to talk about. We didn't talk about visible focus when we were talking about keyboard only navigation. It's something that's very helpful for keyboard-only navigation to be able to visually see where the cursor is as folks navigate through your form. In this case, they actually add a three-dimensional quality to the field by adding a drop shadow that pops the field off of the background sort of with a visual effect. This is helpful for most users. It could be something that you might want to be aware of if you use magnification, but also the animation of the field sort of popping off the page can be a little bit distracting for some users. The other thing that I will also note about both of these forms is that they are multi-column. A single column form is a bit easier to navigate and understand than a multi-column form.
Absolutely.
All right.
All right, let's put the pieces together. Does the perfect form exist? No, there is no recipe for a perfect form, but there are some basic rules of thumb. Understand the purpose of the form. Only ask for information you need. Keep your labels simple yet clear. Ensure labels and fields are properly associated. Give appropriate, simple hints, and ensure all users can interact with form components. Provide clear and appropriate feedback at all times. I'm going to open it up for questions. I don't see any in the chat or the QA, but I'd love to open it up if anybody does have questions. We have about 2 minutes left.
That was a wonderful session, Sarah and Alisa. I think you covered most of the pitfalls and also with the recommendations. I loved the session, and I hope, if anyone has a question, maybe we have 2 more minutes to address that.
And if folks don't want to ask in public, we're also available, info@audioeye.com. If folks have questions they want to contact us privately, that's perfectly fine.
Absolutely.
Ooh, looks like you have a question.
Any suggestions for phone number input fields? How to provide hints for formatting without placeholder text? That's a great one, because a lot of times your phone number fields, your forms will default it to the correct format, right? So if I put in my phone number, it's going to recognize, if I'm using a form library, most of the time, it's going to recognize what format I want it in and put it in that format. But let's say you're an international customer, like we see this a lot. I see the international code in like a combo box ahead of the phone number field. And then I'll see the area code as a separate field. And then I'll see the, the region code as a separate field. And then the number itself is a separate field. And all of these are their own specific fields. And so if you haven't labeled those properly in a way for somebody to understand what you're asking for, you could be very, very confusing on what's going on there. I've seen the other things I've seen is when they have the internationalization, they have the country code, and it's a bunch of flags. It doesn't have the number, it just has your flag, and you have to find your flag. If you're visually impaired, how am I going to find my teeny tiny little flag? I've seen that happen before. Alisa, what else have you seen in testing with phone number input field?
Well, I think the suggestion for the fields is providing the hints for formatting is perhaps for a phone number, if you're in the US, it might be best to just collect the 10 digits and not ask them to format the data. If your system requires a specific format, then I would suggest being more rigid and actually doing some field validation, asking for the format you need in the label. So if you need parentheses around your area code and you need a +1 for the US and you need a dash between your prefix and your number, be very prescriptive. Tell them exactly what you need. just do it in the label. And you can use X's or number symbols to represent the numbers, or 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 also works nicely. But I do think just collecting the 10 digits is probably the best bet, and then doing post-processing for the system so that allows users to just enter their numbers, and you have sort of less direction that you have to give to the user, so to speak.
Absolutely.
Thank you very much for the question and as well as the wonderful answer. So with that, we're going to wrap up the session. Please visit uxpa.org for the recorded session and as well as upcoming short courses. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And thank you, Alisa and Sarah.
You're so
Happy
welcome.
to be with you. Thank
for having
you.
us.